Since October 2023, Palestinians in Gaza have endured the first live-streamed genocide in history, one that has shattered nearly every record of the modern world. And Canadian-made weapons have been used in fueling this violence.
Weapons worth almost $80 million would be manufactured by Canada.
While Canadian politicians continue to insist no arms are being sent to Israel, the evidence tells a different story. Through a gigantic loophole in Canadian export law, weapons, parts, and bullets bypass national safeguards and international obligations, landing in the hands of the IOF committing genocide in Gaza. To understand Canada's role, the loophole that makes it possible, and the efforts underway to finally close it.
Speaker, I rise today to introduce my private member's bill, the No More Loopholes Act.
We'll dive into history, unpack policy, and show why this matters. This is the story of how Canada arms Israel's genocide.
We will not have any form of arms or parts of arms be sent to Gaza.
Since the start of the genocide, Canada has been providing political cover through biased policies and misinformation about Canadian arms sales to Israel and downplaying the atrocities happening in Gaza. The truth is that Canada is allowing arms companies to sell weapons and profit from Israel's genocide, putting Canada at risk of violating both domestic and international law. We even have a crown corporation, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, that uses Canadian tax dollars to help companies sell their arms to the US through the US loophole. On November 18, 2025, the Arms Embargo Now Coalition, of which CJPME is a member of, released a detailed report showing how the Canadian government has been circumventing its own export rules by allowing hundreds of unregulated arms shipments to Israel through the US, and further enable Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. Also in July 2025, the same coalition released another report exposing Canada's ongoing weapon shipments directly to Israel. Similarly, in January of the same year, Project Plowshares documented that Canadian-made parts were used in every production run of F-35 to date, including the ones sent to Israel. And the scale of these shipments is significant.
What we also just discovered is over 150 shipments of Canadian explosives. These are made in Canada, in Quebec, at General Dynamics factories, and these are being sent to the US Army ammunition plants that manufacture those famous 2,000-pound Mk-84 bombs, the 155mm shells, the 120mm tank rounds for Israel. So when we're looking at Israel's weapons, turns out that these bombs have Canadian parts in them. And in fact, the Valleyfield, Quebec plant is the only supplier of the specific triple-base propellant that is used for these 155mm artillery shells that Israel has been deploying non-stop in its assault on Gaza.
This makes Canada complicit in genocide.
We have always supported Canada's accession to the Arms Trade Treaty, but we want to do this properly. We want to accede fully to the treaty, not just by half measures.
Canada formally adopted most of the Arms Trade Treaty into domestic legislation in June 2018, promising to regulate its arms exports and prevent those weapons from being used to commit human rights abuses, creating a legal obligation to ensure Canadian weapons do not contribute to war crimes. Yet despite these obligations, Canadian-made weapons continue to reach Israel. By allowing arms sales to continue under these circumstances, Canada is violating both the spirit and the letter of its own laws and the Arms Trade Treaty. This is more than a technicality. It opens Canada up to accountability for human rights abuses and signals to the world that Canadian law can be bent when geopolitical interests are at stake. Every shipment of arms, every component supplied, carries legal and moral weight. Canada is not merely failing to act, it is intentionally allowing corporations to profit from Israel's atrocities against Palestinians. So how does Canada continue to arm Israel's genocide without facing any consequences? How can it export weapons and components to Israel while bypassing their own export regulations? The answer lies in several legal loopholes. The first one is that Canada never adopted Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty into domestic law that explicitly bans arming genocides or other crimes against humanity like apartheid. The second is that Canada also didn't adopt Article 4 of the Arms Trade Treaty, which requires states to assess parts and components like they are the full weapons systems. And the third and by far the largest loophole, dates back to the beginning of the Cold War.
Welcomed in Canada by Mr. Massey, the Governor General, and Mr. Saint Laurent, the Prime Minister, the President of the United States
In the 1950s, Canada and the US signed the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, DPSA, a pact that deeply integrated their military supply chains. It allowed Canadian firms to sell weapons and components directly to the US Department of Defense. The agreement's original purpose was to reduce procurement barriers and align North American defense production to respond quickly to military demands during the emerging Cold War.
To defend it against the encroachment of international communism in this hemisphere.
This agreement effectively created a North American, rather than a sovereign, Canadian military-industrial complex. It ensured Canadian arms manufacturers were fully integrated into the American empire and its geopolitical objectives. But as a result of this pact, many items on Canada's export control list never required export permits for sales to the US. Global Affairs Canada explicitly wrote regulations exempting itself from administering Canadian law for most weapon export to the US. That means that most Canadian weapons, components, and ammunition can end up in US-made weapons systems that are later delivered to third countries, all without reporting, tracking, or auditing. While this loophole was designed to counter the so-called Soviet threat of the Cold War, in the decades since, it has been vastly repurposed to serve US imperial and military interests, particularly across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, where the US is involved in covert forever wars, both directly and through proxies. Between 2014 and 2018, Canadian company General Dynamics' large light armored vehicle program saw vehicles and parts end up in cross-border operations into Yemen. Several government reviews questioned whether those reports were being used unlawfully. In fact, between 1993 and 2015, Canada estimated to have exported more than 2,900 LAVs to Saudi Arabia, many of which were routed via the US. Those exports alone totaled approximately 2.5 billion Canadian dollars. All of this was made possible through the same opaque transfer routes. This intentional circumvention of Canadian law has allowed its arms and components to contribute to war and atrocities around the world, while giving Canadian politicians plausible deniability.
When we look at permits for export to Israel in particular, in recent years our government has not received and therefore has not approved any export permits for weapons.
Today, that same system is enabling the shipments of weapons used to fuel Israel's genocide in Gaza. This loophole is more than a legal technicality. It's a gateway that allows Canada to arm conflicts while avoiding scrutiny. But every shipment, every component carries real-world consequences. In Gaza, there has been at least 96,000 people killed by North American-supplied munitions. By leaving this loophole open, Canada is digging itself further into complicity in human rights abuses and war crimes. Its own laws and the Arms Trade Treaty obligations it has signed are being vastly undermined. International law is clear. Knowingly supplying weapons used in genocide or war crimes can trigger accountability at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Closing this loophole is not just about ethics. It's about protecting Canada from legal liability, restoring transparency, and ensuring that Canadian arms are not used to commit atrocities. It's about making sure Canadian policies matches Canadian values, upholding human rights, respecting international law, and refusing to enable genocide and war crimes abroad. Without action, Canada remains on a dangerous path, legally exposed, morally compromised, and complicit in the deaths of civilians. But why isn't Canada closing the loophole? The biggest reason is political will. The Canada-US defense partnership is deeply entrenched, politically, economically, and militarily. The DPSA and NORAD have made Canada's arms industry dependent on US contracts for over 70 years.
Over 50% of our arms exports are to the United States. But we don't know the actual percentage because those exports are not only not tracked, they aren't reported. And so we have no idea how many of our arms are being sold to the United States.
Closing the loophole would mean introducing independent oversight on US-bound exports, something Ottawa fears would disrupt the North American defense supply chain. Simply put, it would anger Washington and complicate Canada's seamless military integration with the US. Raising the question, shouldn't Canada be acting as an independent country? And while politicians frame the loophole as efficiency, in reality it keeps Canadian defense manufacturing dependent on US war production, which often fuels wars like in Yemen and the genocide in Gaza. Maintaining it provides Canada with both legal ambiguity and political cover.
Any exemption that we provide the US is not a loophole.
This allows the government to maintain public messaging like Canada does not send weapons or issue export permits for Canadian companies to sell weapons to Israel, while knowing full well that Canadian components are ending up there. It's plausible deniability mechanism built into law, politically convenient, legally indefensible. And because the government refuses to close the loophole, the only way to do so is through a private member's bill.
Speaker, I rise today to introduce my private member's bill, the No More Loopholes Act.
If you're set to retire this year and the corporation you work for goes bankrupt, there's a law that makes sure your pension is first in line to be paid. That's Private Members Bill C-233, introduced by Conservative MP Marilyn Gladu in 2022. Canada's foreign aid is now more transparent thanks to Bill C-293 by Liberal MP John McKay in 2007. Parliament has hundreds of MPs, so after each election, a lottery runs to decide the order in which each MP can propose their own bill, one of the few tools that MPs have to push legislation outside the government's agenda. Given there are 343 MPs, not everyone gets their bill debated by Parliament before the next election, and they go through Parliament in groups of 30. Rarely do all MPs get their bill debated. Each private member's bill goes through first and second readings, committee stage, reporting stage, a third reading, then onto the Senate to follow the same process. And finally, royal assent makes it law. This year, lottery number 21 was for NDP MP Jenny Kwan of Vancouver East. Her proposed Bill C-233, the No More Loopholes Act, was debated for the first time on November 19th.
That we do not contribute our weaponry, parts, and components in atrocities, in committing genocide and crimes against humanity, Mr. Speaker. I don't think Canadians want blood on their hands, and this is what it means.
Jenny Kwan's Bill C-233, the No More Loopholes Act, is designed to close the legal gaps that have allowed Canadian-made weapons, parts, and components that have reached conflict zones unchecked. It defines military goods to include all parts, components, and technology. Exports are banned to places where weapons could be used for genocide, crimes against humanity, or attacks on civilians. No exemptions, even the US. Exporters must provide end-use certificates from the receiving country confirming weapons won't be misused. This bill ensures Canada can't hide behind loopholes, exceptions, and omissions while its arms fuel conflict and genocide. Her legislation forces transparency, accountability, and alignment with Canadian and international law. That's exactly why Carney's government doesn't want to pass it.
And so for all those reasons, I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
Carney's economic plan is based on capitalizing on the weapons trade, and he doesn't appear to really care much about human rights. Those are just externalities to his balance sheets. Canada's role in the genocide is not just political, it's material. Weapons, parts, and components were actively used by Israel in the genocide through legal loopholes, undermining both Canadian law and international obligations. Jenny Kwan's No More Loophole Act is a chance to close these gaps, increase transparency, and ensure Canada is held accountable for the human impact of its exports. If these gaps persist, who knows where it will lead next, and which human rights abuses or genocides Canada could be arming. This isn't just about foreign policy. It's about Canada's moral integrity at home and abroad. In late February 2026, members of Parliament will vote on whether to accept Bill C-233, the No More Loopholes Act. If you believe that Canada's military exports to the US should be independent of US global imperial interests and foreign policy, governed by real transparency, monitoring and permit oversight, and fully compliant with international law, take action. Email your member of Parliament using the first link in the description. Your voice genuinely matters in this vote and can make a difference. If you found this documentary informative, consider donating to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. CJPME is a human rights and advocacy organization fully funded by Canadians. Your support makes these documentaries possible.